Hey, everybody, it's me. I'm actually recording this open long after this conversation that I had with Dan Senor, which we're going to keep unedited. But I just wanted to give a heads up that since we recorded this, there's been kerfuffles, intrigues, murmurations, and other suggestions that the unity government may be changing, folding, spindling, something or other. I just didn't want it to seem like Dan Senor, who has a up to the minute and granular grasp of all things Israel, got something wrong. He was right when he was saying what he said, and I think we didn't edit anything out because I think the substance and the broader thrust of what he was saying was worth keeping in. But just wanted to give you a heads up about that. And with that, let's go to the thing that we made the recording with the words and stuff. Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I am back from my travels. Before I go on more travels, I am neither tan nor rested nor ready. But I am excited about today's guest. We got Dan Senor back in I think the term for this is hizzy. And he is he's wound down his book tour per se, but the book is a wonderful book, The Genius of Israel, and he's also just been sort of flooding the zone as best he can since October 7th. He is often, and this is kind of saying something, he's often the go-to guy for the commentary podcast to talk about Israel, which is,
you know you're deep.
That's
you
deep.
know you're deep.
Yeah.
If you're like, when the commentary podcast wants to talk about Israel and Jewish issues, they go to you.
They're
right.
Like, that is some liner note and B-side stuff right there. And so Dan Senor, welcome back to the Remnant. Great to have you.
Great to be with you, Jonah. Thanks for having me on.
All right. So let's just do this let's pretend someone was on vacation for a month, something like that, and really wasn't following the news, wasn't following the Israel stuff with the granular attention span. Where are we? Like, what is the state of play in terms of the war, in terms of Israeli politics, and then we'll pivot to American politics in a bit.
So in the last few weeks, I'd say a few things are clear, and I'm just back from Israel a couple weeks ago, so I was actually trying to ask this question of every person I met with, similar to how you were asking it, not exactly, but with that kind of frame.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the war, as weird as this is to say, but I'll just say it, the war is going well.
Mm-hmm.
There's about 24, but I mean, if you just think in military terms, there are about 24 battalions that comprise Hamas. The Israeli military and the Israeli war cabinet members, or at least the ones I saw, believe that they have destroyed about 18 of them. Now, it doesn't mean that 18 of them, every
right.
fighter in that battalion is dead or captured. It just means that the structure of the battalion is broken. It's smashed. So you may have individual fighters that are scrambling and can still ambush Israeli soldiers and cause trouble. But the point of the Israeli war cabinet and the military is they're systematically breaking down the structure and the infrastructure of Hamas. And I just parenthetically want to say that this is extremely important because we tend to think of Hamas as a terrorist organization, which it is. But what we don't always appreciate is it is actually organized like an army.
Right.
And so breaking down command structures and breaking down the infrastructure of this army is extremely important. They believe they've destroyed about 18 of these battalions. They've learned a lot along the way. They in terms of how to fight Hamas, they are dealing with a battlefield that no military in modern times has ever dealt with. And this is not, I mean, I'm not a military expert, but
Mm-hmm.
I talk to military experts. And there's this guy, John Spencer, for instance, who's the head of urban warfare at West Point. You may have seen. I mean, he points out, he's looked at every counterinsurgency that a military has had to face in modern times. And as many comparisons as one tries to find to what Israel's dealing with Hamas in Gaza. The closest analogy is fighting ISIS in Mosul. Even there, you have there's no military that's ever experienced having to fight an enemy that has access to 250 miles plus 300 miles plus of underground tunnels, so it can fight under a civilian population. So the fact that so keep in mind some of these battalions they're fighting are hiding under these tunnels and basing themselves under these tunnels. So they've knocked out about 18 of them. There are obviously a few battalions remaining. Unfortunately, according to the Israelis, they're the best trained battalions that have yet to be fought, and they are in the most difficult place to fight, which is it sounds like there's a couple perhaps in Khan Yunis, more in the center of the Gaza Strip, but the majority of them are in Rafah, which is all the way on the border with Egypt, deep into Gaza. It is where over half of Gaza's population is concentrated right now, so 1.3, 1.5 million people in Rafah, concentrated, very dense place, partly concentrated there because the Israelis moved a lot of them there because many of them were up north, and when Israel was fighting up north, they wanted to get them out of the way, the civilians, so they moved a lot of them down south. Now they're down south, and they've got to fight them down there. So the Israelis believe they are close. They are close to winning this war. They are close to getting Hamas leadership. That sounds like they just took out another key figure in the last couple of days. They believe they're close to Yahya Sinwar, who was the architect of October 7th. They know they have found one spot already where he was hiding out, but had since scattered. But they have reason to believe that he had scattered quite soon, like right before they got there. They are they're systematically taking out a lot of these tunnels. There's still only about 40% of the tunnels taken out, according to the Israelis, but 40% of 250 to 300 miles of tunnels is a lot of tunnels, particularly because Israel didn't really know those tunnels were there.
Right.
So militarily, it is going well. I think that
just one quick point on the tunnel thing, because I think this gets lost with people. Not only is it a huge amount of underground territory, but when you read about urban warfare, and I was on this crazy urban warfare kick early in the Ukraine war, and I listened to a bunch of things with John Spencer on it, and I was reading up on it. And one of the points Spencer makes is like the problem with urban warfare is it's a 360 view, right? Because people can come from below, but they also shoot from above. And all this kind of stuff. There are lots of sieges of cities that have subterranean stuff because most cities have sewers, right? And other forms of and basements and that kind of stuff. But sewers and basements and anything like that and utility tunnels, none of them were designed for war fighting.
Right.
So it's a really important distinction when people say, when you say it's not just that they're tunnels, and also when it's sewers and utility things, there are plans that tell you where they are, right? When there are secret tunnels built for war fighting with trapdoors and all sorts of stuff, it's a completely different thing than any other form of urban combat that we've seen, at least in the modern era.
That is exactly right. And as a side note, there will be a commission of inquiry when this war is over about how Israel, and not just Israel, but especially Israel, missed so many signs of what led to October 7th. But to me, the one I am fixated on is this tunnel system. Because to build what they basically built a city underground.
Yeah.
And it was years, 10, 15 years in the making. Just when you think about the amount of equipment and cement and engineering tools and engineers. And I'm thinking about it's like building a subway system. It's like literally building an underground. It's bigger than the London Tube system.
With UN money.
Right, with UN money. But just thinking about all the resources coming in through the border with Egypt and how that eluded Israel, the U.S. intelligence, and Egypt. Now, I think Egypt was not so blind to it, but that's another subject.
Yeah.
But anyway, so it's very difficult, and they're making extraordinary progress. I don't want to. Obviously, I hate to say what I'm about to say, but I'll say it. There have been well over 200 Israeli casualties in Gaza since the war began. That number is trending down, meaning most of those casualties were in the early months of the fighting. The frequency of those casualties is way down. Again, one hates to say these things because, for all the obvious reasons, but it is true. And when you ask the IDF why that is, it's because they're learning how to fight in Gaza, which they didn't know really how to do when the war began. Okay, so that's the military front. Israeli society and Israeli politics are, despite what you see over here in terms of the coverage of it, is still about as unified as one can imagine. There is a complete consensus, total consensus in Israeli politics from right to left, that despite personal animus between different members of Israel's war cabinet, Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, Yoav Gallant, who's the defense minister, and then the two observers in the war council, despite personal animus between many of these men, there's total agreement on the strategy and the goals. And so, in the country, it's reflective in public polling too. The country, there is no constituency in Israel today, or at least no constituency of meaningful size, that wants to change the war strategy, which means, and I'll get to what this means in a moment, but it means win the war, defeat Hamas, wipe out the infrastructure, and restore some kind of deterrent capability in Israel's southern border, and try to figure out what Israel's going to have to do in the northern border with Hezbollah, with Lebanon. But it sounds like that will heat up even more than it's already heating up. So there's total consensus, and Israeli society is still pretty, and this is something I talk about in my book, about the resilience of Israeli society when especially when things get tense. I still see that resilience. I still see that unity. Obviously, the hostage movement, what we call the hostage movement, which are the families of the over 100 hostages still in Gaza, attract a lot of attention, as they should. They are, at times, not always, and depending on which, there are different factions within the hostage families movement, but are sometimes extremely critical of the Israeli government. And one can totally understand why, because they're just want their loved ones home, period, full stop, like, make it happen. Why can't you make it happen? And I understand that. And I've spent a lot of time with these family members, or some of them, and I completely understand their just utter, anyways. I don't even know what to say about it. But generally, the overwhelming majority of Israelis are behind. And you can just see this, and we can talk about different ways to measure it. But the overwhelming majority of Israelis, there are no cracks in the Israeli Israeli politics as it relates to what to do about the war. So then the question is, the two big outstanding questions are, one, Rafah, which is I mentioned, this town, if you will, this area in sort of the southern part of Gaza, deep, right there with the Egyptian border. That's where the next fight has to take place. The Israelis know that will be ugly for both sides, and despite the drop in Israel, the frequency of Israeli casualties, it's likely that will be a tough fight, most likely. But there have been a lot of estimates that have been wrong. Parenthetically, the U.S. Had warned Israel before it went in on the ground after October 7th. Remember, Biden had warned Israel, be careful. We were angry too after 9/11. We learned, we regret a lot of decisions we made in Iraq and Afghanistan. Be careful what you try to do to remedy, this situation. And they sent over a senior U.S. military officer to meet with the war cabinet and tell them that their plans were going to result in massive number of casualties. Interestingly, on the Israeli side, interestingly, in that meeting, he forecasted that they were going to get 10 times the Israeli casualties that Israel has had. So as I said, Israel's done pretty well. But Rafah will be, I presume, I expect it to be a tough fight. The Israelis believe it'll be a tough fight. And the Biden administration is, and we can get into this, is very concerned about it. They're very concerned about Israel's plans to move as many civilians as possible. And they actually, I think, some of them, not all, but I think some in the Biden administration would prefer that Israel just somehow not do Rafah. And I guess this gets to the key point about the consensus in Israel. When I say the Israelis are totally behind the mission, there's a recognition among the overwhelming majority of Israelis that life in Israel doesn't have a shot of returning to normalcy. Meaning, let's start at a minimum. At a minimum, How do you measure return to normalcy? At a minimum, those Israelis who are in the kibbutzim and the other towns in southern Israel, who still 5 months in are not at home.
Yeah.
Right. They are literally they are the technical term of internally displaced. They are internally displaced in their own country. I've met with many of these communities who are living in, these kibbutzim, these agriculture farming communities from the south, who are all now living together in an apartment building in central Tel Aviv. And they can't return home. It's totally and utterly, not only have these people's lives been in some cases destroyed, turned upside down, family members underground in Gaza, lost loved ones. I mean, you can go dealing with the aftermath of sexual assault. I mean, the worst possible. They just can't return home. They just can't. So, and you're talking about, hundreds of thousands of people when you talk about those in the south, and then those in the north whose homes have not been destroyed, but there's just fear that there could be another war up north, so they are moved. Until Israel can get these people back to their communities and return to some semblance of normalcy, and obviously the rest of the country feeling secure, this isn't over. And and you can't get that if Hamas is still intact, and Hamas will still be intact if Israel does not go into Rafah. So Israel has to go into Rafah. They have to kill or capture Hamas's leadership and wipe out the remaining infrastructures. Benny Gantz, who's a former defense minister, former IDF chief of staff, who is a leader of one of the non-governing parties in Israel, very oppositional to Netanyahu, but he's in the war cabinet. He joined as a form in a kind of coalition government, a unity government post October 7th. As he just said in Washington a week ago, he said to ask us to stop this war before we go into Rafah is like a fire department being called in to put out a fire that's burning at a house and only put out 80% of the fire and leave 20% burning, which means you're going to have to come back and finish the job. At some point, it's just a matter of when, because the fire will come breathing back and Hamas will come breathing back. And they haven't made this point, but I've been making this point. It's not just about Israel and Hamas. It's if at the end of this, if after Hamas has been able to unleash the most violent day for the Jewish people, the most barbaric day against the Jewish people in a single day or single weekend in the history of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And at the end of it, Israel strikes back, but the Hamas leadership is still kind of standing and still be able to say, we're still here, and then continue to intimidate Gazans and kind of sort of run Gaza. The propaganda victory for Israel's enemy, and I would say enemies of the West generally, will be extraordinary. If Hamas is seen to be still standing after this, it has geopolitical implications that go far beyond Israel and Hamas. And I think Israelis should be saying that more often and explaining that. I wish the American leadership were making this point. This is what we're watching here is a civilizational struggle, and the stakes in terms of the outcome are go far beyond just Israel and Hamas. So I think that's where the showdown is going to be, is over this fight over Rafah.
So, all right, bunch of different ways we can go from here. First of all, we should say, so let me do it this way. Increasingly in the U.S., the debate is entirely focused on Palestinian casualties, civilian casualties. I just wrote a column about how under no normal actual definition of genocide is this genocide, but that doesn't mean reasonable people can't criticize the amount of collateral damage being done to Palestinians. I might have responses to it or assign blame differently than they would, but there are a lot of negative adjectives that someone can defensively apply to Israel's conduct in this that I may still disagree with, but at least you can have a good faith argument about. Genocide's just a lie, right? And there was this really useful piece in Tablet this week. We'll put in the show notes.
Abraham Weiner, professor at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. Fantastic piece. That
gets into the statistical impossibility of the Hamas Health Authority casualty numbers. It's very similar. Part of the argument, it's very interesting. Some of listeners may recall I had a guy from The Economist on to talk about COVID mortality rates a few years ago. And one of the reasons why we know Russia's casualty death toll numbers for COVID was wrong was this point about how the uniformity of the numbers, particularly in Russia, was great. It was like on weekdays, it was X. And then on weekends, it would drop off because the bureaucrats who were faking the numbers would go home. And then on Monday, it would go back to the exact same numbers again. Right. And like in real life, it's a scatter point thing where you have averages that can be remarkably stable, but the actual raw numbers reported would be all over the place, with one day there being zero and another day there being a huge number, and they average out to something. And the Gaza ones are sort of uniform in the reporting, which is a classic sign of juicing the stats.
And there's no reflection whatsoever of the variance in how Israel's conducting military strikes. So it just doesn't make sense.
Right.
So like there's, for instance, now Israel has not made a big deal of this publicly, but they are doing pauses during the day, like certain times of day. They do a few hours of pausing, of not fighting. They've pulled back in recent weeks considerably in their war fighting, partly because they pulled back a bunch of reservists, and they're actually figuring out how to gear up for Rafah. Right. But yet the numbers haven't changed at all. It's like every day there's the incremental increase, as though
it's 357 people a day, regardless of what Israel is doing, which just makes no sense, right? And it's always 2/3 women and children.
Right.
Now we can be kind of dismissive and gloaty and snarky about this, but whatever and I'm perfectly willing to argue that the numbers are inflated, and there are a lot of useful idiots in the West who are buying them uncritically. But the reasonable response to that is, but the numbers are still really high. We just don't know what they are. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that the numbers of dead are much higher among Hamas fighters, for whom I have very little sympathy. But there are obviously women and children and bystanders who are being killed and all the rest. How is this whole argument playing in Israel? Right? Is the thing is Americans just don't understand? They're suckers. They're being conned. Or, I mean, obviously, there's a huge peacenik community in Israel, and which would be, you would think, sympathetic to some of this stuff. Is this debate happening? How is it different there than it is here?
Yeah. So first of all, I too, as I said, was kind of blown away by that tablet piece, and it's funny. I wanted to do, and still might do, an episode just on that piece, but my producer Alon said, "Well, be careful. We don't want to sound like," it's exactly the point you're making. You get bogged in the data, and it sounds like you're dismissing that there's actually a lot of suffering going on. So it is like a human catastrophe. There's no question, regardless of how much one slices and dices the data. Although I do think legitimizing the Gaza Health Ministry, which is really just like a propaganda arm of Hamas, is, and I do worry about what the Biden administration is doing in terms of suddenly dropping from the qualifiers about the Gaza Health Ministry, which is new and sort of out of nowhere in the last few days, that they now are legitimizing their numbers. It's dangerous because of where the Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, could start going with crazy numbers once they're legitimized by the U.S. But be that as it may, inside Israel, so as you know, Israel, since basically the first Intifada in 1987, has been deeply divided over the issue of two-state solution, Palestinian state, how much land to give to the Palestinians, what does sovereignty for the Palestinians look like, how do you balance sovereignty for the Palestinians and security for Israelis, Palestinian rights, don't Palestinians have a right to self-determination, et cetera, et cetera. So that defined, obviously, the Rabin and Peres years in the 90s. Obviously, there was the Oslo peace process that led to catalyzed the rise of Benjamin Netanyahu in his first race for prime minister in 1996, which he basically ran against the Oslo peace process. Then it led to the return of the pro-peace camp, the pro-two-state solution camp in 1999 with the election of Ehud Barak, who at the time was the leader of the Labour Party, who ran on a two-state solution, restoring the Rabin-Peres track, right? He went to Camp David with Clinton and Arafat and offered the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and even East Jerusalem, or at least part of East Jerusalem, as a Palestinian capital. And then, obviously, Ehud Olmert, 2006, runs for prime minister on saying, I'm going to do for the West Bank what Sharon did for Gaza, meaning Sharon pulled out of Gaza, I'm going to pull out of the West Bank, even if I got to do it unilaterally. He gets elected prime minister on that platform.
Right.
Back and forth. And then obviously Bibi returns following Olmert's premiership. So Israel's been deeply divided on these issues, and there's been governments that bounce back and forth on it. There has always been, I'd say the second intifada, so basically in the early 2000s, after that moment where Clinton and Barak and Arafat are at Camp David, and Barak makes this what's unprecedented offer to Arafat. Arafat walks away from it, and it's followed by basically a year and a half to 2 years of 240 terrorist attacks inside Israel, mostly suicide bombings. And most Israelis, including the Israeli left, are perplexed by this. Not only are they traumatized by it, but they are perplexed. Like, how did this happen? We're trying to make peace. We offered a Palestinian state, and this is what follows it. I can understand continued negotiations, but suicide bombing, like the orchestrated, and one could argue the Israeli left never recovered from that. But even that, meaning, because if you look at Israeli politics since then, there other than Olmert, which was sort of a deviation, it's either Netanyahu, it's been Naftali Bennett as prime minister. It's been all people of the right, and the left has not really been forward leaning and making the case for a two-state solution. Not that they didn't want it, they just didn't think it was in the cards. There was no path to it anytime soon. That said, there were still some on the very hard left in Israel that was still hanging on, right? So if the majority of Israel, the right, the center, and the center left, had given up on a two-state solution, at least at a practical level, you can theorize about it as a goal, as a vision, but strategically, it was just like there was nobody to negotiate such a thing with. There was still some on the hard left that were hanging on and making the case for it. And I would say, Jonah, that segment, which was small but loud.
Mm-hmm.
So they were still major players, disproportionate to their actual numbers in the Israeli political ecosystem. That's over. They in other words, Hamas has actually they've driven those people out of advocacy for a two-state solution. It's so striking to me. I don't want to bore you with all these names, but let me just say there are for the people who follow Israeli politics closely. There are some very outspoken, as I said, have a disproportionately loud voice and disproportionate impact on the hard left, and they're kind of people who sometimes have made me crazy. And they themselves now are. They support what the war cabinet is doing. Mm-hmm. So and here's the way the best way to kind of encapsulate this. Where did many of these people live? Many of them lived in southern Israel.
Right.
These are the people who lived in these kibbutzim in the south. They were known as like this ultra peace camp. In 2014, during the last major Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, meaning where Israel dropped a major, had a major ground operation, went over 50 days. It was one of the longer ones before this one. And the Israeli constituency that was most active, forcing and pressuring the Israeli government to stop the war, were these kibbutzim in the south. These were people who were organizing to stop it. These are people who, in the months and years leading up to October 7th, would volunteer to go to the Gaza border and meet. They were involved with these nonprofits that would take Palestinians living in Gaza to get medical checkups, and some of them had diabetes and they needed insulin, whatever it was. These peace activists living in these communities in the south were the ones doing that work. The one that strikes me the most, because I know a little much more about his family, is a guy named Ayel Waldman, who's was the founder of a very successful tech company called Mellanox, which he sold to NVIDIA, which is in the news these days. And he sold Mellanox to NVIDIA for multiple $billion deal. And he has been so active on behalf of Palestinians. He set up for Mellanox, for his company, development centers in the West Bank and in Gaza. He was trying to train and employ Palestinians living in these places as something that was within his control. Well, how can I get us to a path to normalization? How can I help them with state building? The one thing I can do is build economic infrastructure for these people and give them, an economic future. His daughter was slaughtered on October 7th. She was at the Nova Music Festival. So I'm just saying that this to me is not as common in like other conflicts around the world, where the very people who had been most outspoken, and not just outspoken, but integrating into their daily lives, work and activism to advance the future and the rights of the Palestinian people, they were the hardest hit by this attack on October 7th.
Right. It's sort of like if terrorists hit Santa Monica and Park Slope and that kind of thing.
And that they're the ones who suffered like they got hit with most of the casualties, like if they were the ones. And so they're, when you talk to them now, they're done. So yes, they say it's terrible that Palestinian civilians, as you said, there's some number of them. We can debate the numbers. Yes, it's terrible that some of them are getting killed, but it's war. And this is what happens in war. And there wasn't a war on October 6th. And there's a war now. And we have to, we have to we have to have basic security. And so they sound as hawkish as, I would say, the center-right members of this Netanyahu-led government.
Okay, so until the very end there, though, we were talking about something, and I let you go on because it was interesting, and I was glad to hear it. But we were talking about something slightly different than the question, which was this actual debate about, and I'm largely with you on this. As I said in my LA Times column about the genocide thing, like if I was in my basement in Dresden in 1945, it would feel like genocide. It would certainly feel indiscriminate because it kind of was in Dresden, right?
Yeah.
If I were on the outskirts
almost
of Hiroshima,
by design,
right? If I were outside of Hiroshima, I would feel like it was genocide. But neither of those things were genocide. You can't make the case about the indiscriminate thing and all of that. And so the question, though, is so I'm with you that it's a war, and I have not seen a lot of evidence that Israel is going out of its way to kill civilians. And it's amazing how this is one of the problems with the genocide argument, is that it gives permission structure to a lot of people in the media to start from the conclusion that that's true, that the genocide thing is true. And then when new facts come in and shoddy reporting comes in, they immediately leap for the opportunity to fit it in that narrative, right? So like I remember listening to the NPR early broadcasts about the truck convoy thing, and their immediate response was to believe Hamas's accusation that Israeli forces reportedly opened fire on people waiting in line for food. That was the original phrasing of it, right? And similarly, that's how AP originally put it. And that is unforgivable unless you have as a baseline assumption, like the indiscriminate or genocidal intent of Israel is established, and therefore these new facts come in and you can plug and play them to fit that narrative. But at the same time, like, is there a debate about all of this? Because I keep avoiding the point. In wars, like it's the law of war that if you use a hospital as a military headquarters or as a staging area for war, the hospital no longer has protections. And the responsibility for turning a hospital into a military target lies with the people who use the hospital as a military asset. It is not Israel's fault that hospitals have become military targets to the extent they have been, which has been exaggerated. It is the fault of Hamas for using it. If you hide behind a hospital, it can't be like, hiding a villain hiding stuff behind lead from Superman, and Superman has no ability to see it now, right? I mean, it's like, like if you're in a hospital and they know you're in a hospital, Israel has every right. Any combatant under the laws of war has a right to do something about it. And so I put a lot of the blame for the horrific deaths in Gaza on Hamas. But at the same time, the death of civilians is still regrettable, and I'm just kind of, again, I'm kind of curious: is this even a topic of conversation in Israel, or is it? I think it's too much of a topic of conversation in America, but that doesn't mean it's not a legitimate topic at all. And I'm just kind of wondering where the Israelis come down on it, or they just think Americans are being weird for even talking about this.
So I don't want this to sound like Israelis are insensitive to Palestinian suffering. But I also want to answer your question very directly. This is not a focus of conversation inside Israel, and that's the truth. But it's not because, again, it's not because Israelis are insensitive. They know it's the Middle East. They know it's a war. And they know a war in the Middle East, if they have a shot of surviving in the Middle East, which is different often than how wars are fought elsewhere, they have to win, and they have to win decisively. And if there are Palestinians who suffer, it's awful, but it's not their fault. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to then, I think this is important. Why this sounds insensitive? It sounds like they're insensitive, but they're not. 360,000 Israelis were called up after October 7th, between reservists and obviously there was the standing army. It's a population of about 9.3 million people. So you just do the math, right? 360,000 people out of a population of 9.3 million people deployed is a massive number.
Right.
In normal times, in non-war times, every Israeli knows someone who is serving in the army or has a family member who's serving in the army, or they themselves are serving in the army. This is something we talk about in our book, just the role that the military and anyone, you've been to Israel, anyone who spent time in Israel, it like the military service permeates society. Everyone is very by the way, this is my theory, parenthetically, why you don't have crazy conspiracy theories in Israel, like the way we have, which you've written about, is about government. Like there's no like deep state fear in Israel because
everyone's kind of worked in that world.
Everyone works for the government, or everyone has a family member who works for the government, and everyone knows the people. Like, so it's very like we talk abstractly about like middle management and the government here because no one knows who middle management is. So it's easy to like ascribe the worst conspiracy theories. In Israel, the middle managers are like the officers running these kids, like companies and battalions and brigades, and so they know all these people. So everyone I know. I was just with a friend of mine from Israel yesterday, and he's like, "Oh yeah, Benny Gantz was my company commander when I was like." They all know these guys, you know.
Yeah. I've always used to say on college campuses, big college campuses get all these weird sort of views about the administration because it's this abstract thing. Yeah. But like in small liberal arts colleges, the powers that be have names.
Right.
It's exactly. Like, oh, that's John, that's Phil, whatever.
Yeah.
And there's a completely different, the demystification of institutions that comes with actually knowing people is a hugely important thing.
Avi Sakharov, who's the co-creator of Fauda, he's an Israeli journalist, and he created the show Fauda, co-created it. And when I was in Israel, I had dinner with him and Lior Raz, the Fauda guys, and he goes, "Oh yeah, we're talking about Yoav Gallant, who's the defense minister, who's the guy running the war." And he says, "Oh yeah, I just met with him a couple days ago. I think he's doing a pretty good job." And I said, "You just met with him?" I was like, "What was this? Like, how do you know him?" He goes, "Oh, we served together." And like, obviously just some civilian making TV shows, and yet he's friends with the defense minister because they both served in the army together. So it completely, so that it's everywhere in normal times.
Right.
Now with all these call-ups, it's like quadruply so. And so what does that mean? Israel, the IDF, and this has been reported, the IDF, and even the Biden administration admits this, if you force them, the IDF is going to lengths. And John Spencer talks a lot about this in his writing. The IDF is going to lengths right now. Andrew Roberts said the historian, the British historian, Andrew Roberts has said there's no military he can track, he can chronicle at any time in history that has fought a war more humanely than the way Israel's fighting this war, meaning going to the lengths Israel is going. Right. The notifications, the warning, telegraphing. John Kirby from the National Security Council has said from the podium at the White House, he said, the IDF telegraphs when it is going to bomb a building, to get civilians out of there. And Kirby basically said, respectfully, like he said it out of almost admiration, but like he said, this is absurd. Like yes, if there are bad guys that you need to kill in a building and there are civilians there, you probably compromise the operation to some degree by telegraphing that you are coming there. And most militaries would just say, well, isn't that too bad? To the point you're saying, Jonah, that, well, Israel didn't put those civilians there. Hamas put the civilians in the building, and tragically, they're going to die because Hamas is there. But yet, the IDF still, as Kirby said, telegraphs, we're coming in the hope that the civilians get out, and hopefully they still get the Hamas operatives that are there. But there's a good chance that the Hamas operatives will get the same warning the civilians did and scatter. And so Israel is fighting this war with the notifications and the constant thought about moving different population centers to make, to reduce the number of casualties. It's going to all these extraordinary lengths. And because so many Israelis are experiencing it, because they're serving, when you have 360,000 plus people that are actually seeing this firsthand, when they're actually involved with this directly, they come home for Shabbat dinner on a weekend. They come home from their reserve duty. They're telling their friends, they're telling their colleagues, they're telling people like me. They're explaining how they're fighting. So you'd be hard pressed to find any Israeli who doesn't have some kind of firsthand account from someone who actually served about the extent Israelis are going to, which is to say, it's not that they're insensitive. They're just aware of the lengths Israel is going to do this as humanly possible in war, as humanely possible in war, but it's still war. And it's a war they believe they got to win. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
actually having skin in the game, and not just because it's your country and it's your life and all that kind of stuff, but like skin in the game in terms of having a much more personal understanding of the facts on the ground inoculates you against a lot of criticism, particularly, and look, I mean, people, listeners who are listening to this, if you're shocked that this is basically a pro-Israel conversation, then I can't help you. But there's a natural human defensiveness. Let's just say that the Israelis are wrong in some abstract way about how they're dealing with Gaza and the civilian casualty issue. Put aside the defensiveness that comes from having witnessed or known people in the October 7 attacks, right? Because people forget also that, we always talk about the death toll. There are a lot of people who weren't killed, but were horribly wounded. And that number, makes it even more likely people know somebody affected by this. And put aside the rapes and all that kind of stuff. When you accuse Israelis or Jews of being like Nazis and genocidal, they're going to get a little defensive. Right? They're not going to be, I think the weird thing about Jews and Israelis is how much they're willing to entertain the ridiculous, accusation more than anything else. But still, they're going to get on the whole defensive, particularly when it's not true. Right. And so understanding that psychology and adding in the fact that these people served in military, they know what the military is actually doing. They're not following MSNBC or Al Jazeera's version of this. They're following the version from their friends or themselves. Right. They're just going to have a different view of it. I think it's an important point to make. I do want to switch to America. Right. Mm-hmm. And I remember early on you were saying on the commentary podcast, elsewhere, on your own excellent podcast, Call Me Back.
Thank you.
I forgot to plug that earlier. I apologize. I broke the podcaster's code.
Yeah. The guild will be reaching out to
you. You were saying at the beginning, and I agreed with you, that Biden was handling this about as well as anyone could hope, more or less, in the early days. He may not have an Iran policy, but his Israel policy was solid, right? Doesn't feel that way anymore. And it feels, this is not exactly really powerfully insightful punditry, but it feels pretty obvious. It seems pretty obvious that Biden and the Democrats generally have decided that they're going to do this. Don't criticize Israel too harsh. but go hammer and tongs against Bibi as if these are different things. And I do not like, I'm not a huge fan of Bibi anymore. And I think when this commission comes, he should be given his gold watch. He did a lot of great things for the country, but it's time.
Yeah.
That said, as you were saying earlier, Benny Gantz, who's a big critic of Bibi, no big buddy of Bibi's.
Hates him.
He's part of this unity government. The people are behind this general policy. Bibi doesn't actually have the power to set policy by himself. I think the way he's behaving is not great because he's clearly kind of like thinking about the politics of all of this stuff, which is what politicians do, but come on. But how is this sort of beat up Bibi, but don't beat up Israel too hard distinction? How's it playing there, and what do you think of it generally? Or am I wrong?
No, so again, yes, I have been, and I've taken a lot of heat from our friends on the right since October 7th for repeatedly defending Biden, because I do think there are so many things he did right. First of all, he got the tone just right
in the beginning.
The way he spoke, the way he spoke about what October 7th meant, which frustrates me more now, but which I'll get to in a moment, because I know he knows how to explain it and he knows how to talk about it. And he talked about it here, and he talked about it in Israel, and he flew to Israel and met with the war cabinet, not as though he were like a member of Israel's war cabinet, talked about taking sides. And he, in every area he could be helpful, as you said, with the exception of his insane Iran policy, but in every area he could be helpful to Israel, he was. He obviously got Israel the munitions and the weapons it needs, and this is despite the dysfunction in Congress, which still can't pass an assistance package for Israel. But he's figured out so many workarounds; it's extraordinary. The lengths his team at the White House have gone to bypass the dysfunction of Congress and make sure Israel has everything it needs, or most of what it needs. He's given Israel diplomatic cover at the UN. Right, he's vetoed every one of these horrendous UN Security Council resolutions. He has. I mean, I can go on and on and on about all the important steps he's taken. Deploying military assets to the Eastern Mediterranean, which I think has had a huge impact on how Hezbollah is willing to do in the north. I think him basically committing, with obviously some uneven results, to taking on the Houthi issue rather than leaving it to Israel. So it's been very important, and to be honest, it went longer than I expected. So here we are, 5 months in, and if you recall, in 2006, the second Lebanon War, 34 days. What happened at day 34? Basically, the Bush administration said, "All right, Prime Minister Omer, we gotta wind this down." 2014 war in Gaza, 50 plus days. I think it was exactly 50 days. And the Obama administration said it's time to wind this down. Those of us who are supportive of Israel and been following this closely have been waiting for that moment. There will be a time, right, where the U.S. steps in and says enough. Like we got to wrap this up. And I didn't know when it would be, but it would be. And if you would have told me 5 months in, a Biden administration, which, oh, by the way, is largely staffed in its national security positions by people who served in the Obama administration, which was quite hostile to Israel, and that this administration is still hanging in there 5 months in, I'd take it. Like it's incredible. And I think most Israelis I speak to, I got into this heated debate on the most recent episode of my podcast with Haviv Rettig-Gur, who I normally agree with, who's an analyst for the Times of Israel, right of center, but independent thinker. And he and I normally agree. We disagreed. And I realized by the end of the conversation, the reason we disagreed is because he was coming at this as an Israeli and I was coming at it as an American. He basically says, Biden gave us 5 months. I'll take it. And he's going to have to turn to us at some point. And he didn't owe us this 5 months. And he gave us this 5 months. And if he now has to worry about Michigan, then go let him worry about Michigan. And, that's kind of his view. That's Haviv's view from an Israeli perspective. My perspective as an American Jew who's in the middle of these debates and fights over here is, one, it is fine for Biden to have issues with the way Israel's fighting the war and try to shape how Israel fights the war. but to use some of the rhetoric he used, like he used in the State of the Union, which was shocking to me. It was validating some of the most insane criticisms of Israel. We talked about the Gaza Health Ministry. For the first time, his administration, which were the ones who early on said you can't trust the Gaza Health Ministry. He now cites the Gaza Health Ministry numbers without any qualification. He said that Israel is using aid as a bargaining chip. I mean, that's just not, what is he talking about? Israel's delivery of humanitarian aid has been, again, complicated and not perfect because it's really hard to do for reasons, if you want to, we can get into. But Israel's not using it as, Israel would love to get humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians, but it would make their warfighting situation better.
Right.
And if they could actually bypass Hamas and actually take care of Palestinians.
Also, just to point out, it's not something genocidal powers usually do.
Right.
Is deliver food aid. But anyway, go on.
But we digress.
Yeah.
Right. But he, he says Israel's using his humanitarian aid. He said things that were he said more Palestinians have been killed in this war than all the Gaza wars combined. Israel's wars. Of course, because in none of those previous Gaza wars has Israel ever had the objective of destroying Hamas.
Right.
In every previous Gaza war, the outcome was expected by Israel was Hamas would stay in power and they would just actually restore some deterrence. This is the only war Israel's fought where it's actually eliminating Hamas, which Israel's been clear about and which Biden has been clear about supporting. So suddenly he was just, I don't want to go, I mean, he was trafficking in, I thought, some of the worst criticisms of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And some of my Israeli friends, like Haviv, said that they could even live with that. I think it's dangerous because I think it's going to invite a pile-on internationally now. People are going to point to Biden and point to things he's saying.
Even Joe Biden says. Blah, 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 blah.
Even Joe Biden said. And then the worst part of it, Jonah, and this is the American Jew in me rather than the Sabra, rather than an Israeli perspective. I thought Biden had a huge missed opportunity in the State of the Union, which was he did not talk about the staggering rise in anti-Semitism in the United States. That was like a no-brainer. It is something, and you know this, every Jew is feeling. I mean, I speak to Jewish audiences all the time.
Yeah.
It's all anyone wants to talk about. It is people are scared. Anyone who is somehow connected, has children at, or is family members they're involved with, or they themselves are involved with a Jewish day school, a synagogue, a Jewish community center. All the talk is about security at these places. What's our security? How are we upgrading our security? Oh, there was a swastika painted on. Oh, there was a protest outside of. Oh, our children, our family members couldn't get into synagogue today because they were pro-Hamas. I mean, this is all. It has this menacing. It's like a menacing environment for Jews, and obviously the ADL and the FBI have produced data that shows that we've had a 3, 4, 500% increase in anti-Semitic incidents, many of them violent since October 7th. Biden knows this. For crying out loud, the second gentleman or whatever he's called, Doug Emhoff spends all his time running around to all these Jewish organizations. They talking about this issue. They know this is a real thing. I think Biden should have talked about that. Now, I know, in any event. And I think if you saw at the beginning of his State of the Union, he laid out, I thought, quite well, the stakes for the U.S. in the Russia-Ukraine war. He explained, he used as an explaining moment, which I thought was important. And he could have done the same thing about Israel and Gaza, even if he was somewhat critical of Gaza. So these were missed opportunities. But at the end of the day, to your point, I'm both frustrated with Biden as someone who has been a great defender of his on Israel. I am cautiously hopeful that this is all performative. That what Biden is doing, it's not to say it's not without damage, because I still think him saying the things he's saying gives fuel and material for Israel's critics around the world to deepen the pile-on. But at the end of the day, the real question is Biden actually going to stand in the way of Israel going into Rafah? He's pretending he will, but is he actually going to? Is he actually going to cut off military supplies for Israel so it can't go into Rafah? Is he actually going to join have the U.S. join or not veto a UN Security Council resolution when Rafah gets ugly? Is he going to do these things? I actually still think he won't, because that's not what he needs. He knows, and he had the slip up in this MSNBC interview he did with Jonathan Capehart a couple of days ago, where he kind of said the quiet part out loud, where Capehart basically asked him, why does Hamas want a ceasefire? And he said Hamas wants a ceasefire so they can consolidate power and survive. Right. And then he caught himself, and then he had one of those weird Biden pauses for 5 seconds where the wheels are turning, and then he comes back and goes on another tangent. I think he knows that Hamas remaining intact is a non-starter. He also has been advised by the people around him that they need to get these images of Palestinian suffering off of the television screens and off of TikTok heading into the fall. And they're probably not going to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. But Biden needs to look like he's trying. And the only way they know of looking like they're trying is to have the equivalent of a WWE fight with Benjamin Netanyahu. Because to your point, Benny Gantz's policy is no different than Netanyahu's on this issue. If you add up where Gantz is polling and you add up where the Likud-led coalition is polling, you've got basically most of the entire Knesset. That's representative of where the country is. So they're not really criticizing the policy, and they know they probably can't change the policy. But if they can frame up a fight that Biden is taking on Netanyahu, because the left in the United States, the kind of professional left in the United States, they hate Netanyahu. And if Biden looks like he's fighting the man, that may be the best they're going to get to try to mollify their progressive base. And I think Biden knows this. Pick a very public fight with Bibi. Bibi knows this. I actually think it's helpful to Netanyahu in his domestic politics. Mm-hmm. And the policy winds up not changing. That's my kind of cautious optimism.
Okay, so put your Jew hat aside, and I don't mean your yarmulke, and put your pro-Israel hat aside, right, and all that kind of stuff, and put your pundit hat on. Yep. Do you think Biden's actually reading the politics of this stuff correctly?
No. I really have thought a lot about this. I even called up my old boss, Spence Abraham, who you know. So Spence, in addition to being a one-term but very effective senator from the state of Michigan, was my first full-time job in politics, working on his campaign in '94, and then being involved with, and then running a statewide referendum with him and Governor Engler in 1998, and then helping with his reelection campaign in 2000, which he lost. He's a Lebanese Christian, and he is very involved with the Arab community in Michigan. Dearborn was a big fact of my life for those years that I was working for Spence. And so when I was working for Senator Abraham, we were very dialed into the tensions between the Jewish community and its politics and the Arab community and its politics in Michigan. And he and I talked about this the other day. The concern about, there are two different groups to talk about. So one is Michigan. Okay. So is Michigan at risk? And if it's at risk, is it at risk because of the Arab community and depressed turnout, as they saw, through some version of this uncommitted vote in the Michigan primary a couple weeks ago? The Arab community, first of all, is not uniformly Muslim. In fact, it's mostly Christian. It's mostly people like Spence Abraham, who are not wound up about what's happening in Gaza. They may not like it. They may not be rah-rah pro-Israel, but they're not amped about it. It's certainly not going to affect, for most of them, their voting behavior. So you're talking about a much smaller faction that's actually represented in the kind of punditry about this. And then the question you ask is, of those who really are amped about it, are they really, when Donald Trump is on the ballot and Donald Trump is in the frame, and the guy who introduced the Muslim ban, are they really not going to turn out to vote for Joe Biden? Maybe a small percentage. I'd be surprised. I mean, the uncommitted vote, being able to show up and vote uncommitted in the Democratic primary, is a no-cost way to make a statement. There's no consequence. There's literally no consequence. You go out, you register no uncommitted, and Joe Biden still gets to be president. In November, doing the equivalent of uncommitted, which is basically staying home, actually has consequences. And I think the community is not going to more or less play that game in November. By the way, I don't even think they played it in such huge numbers this time relative to previous Democratic primaries, but be that as it may, it wasn't that big a showing. So I don't think the Arab community numbers in Michigan matter that much. If Biden is losing Michigan so closely, if it's that close that this tiny community that we're talking about makes this much of a difference, that it's the ball game, that Biden has to make war strategy decisions based on this community, it means Biden is losing in so many other places so badly that it's cooked. It's not about ultimately the war. So then the other community is the progressive community. Let's call
particularly young people.
Yeah, young people and people, kids in college towns, right? Ann Arbor and Madison, Wisconsin, and so if these states, Wisconsin, Michigan, matter, which they do, and if in college towns you get depressed turnout, could that hurt Biden? Or if they wind up voting for an independent candidate, could that hurt Biden? Sure. Again, I cannot believe if they have a problem turning these voters out, these young voters, when Trump is on the ballot, and they're hammering all the issues that, from abortion to, we can go on and on and on that matter. Yeah. The environment, like all these issues that are turnout issues for younger voters. The idea that these voters who will be being told that Donald Trump is going to be president of the United States unless you voters turn out, and that they're going to still choose to not turn out because some of them are upset about what's happening in Gaza. And God knows what's going to be happening in Gaza, by the way, by that point. But by the way, that's partly why my view is Biden should let Israel move on Rafah quickly. Like, why delay it? If Biden knows it's going to happen, why drag it out? It's actually, if he's thinking about his political calendar, he should get it done and over and in the rearview mirror as soon as possible.
Right around finals, I think you should do it on college campuses.
Exactly. Right. Imagine that conversation with Bibi. So I think the threat from the left being and depressed turnout from the left is overstated. The flip side of this, and I say this all the time, and my Democratic friends think I'm crazy. I really believe it. I think there's such an opportunity for Biden to take on these crazies, and have his own quote unquote sister soldier moment, and because I do think there are a lot of Americans out there who are not involved with the Israel issue, who aren't wearing their quote unquote Jew hat, have no connection to Israel, but they're just watching this chaos. I hear this from non-Jewish friends of mine all the time who are not in major cities, by the way. These are not people who live in New York or LA or Chicago, or they're people who live like in the Midwest who are not, and they're even seeing it. They're seeing the craziness, and meaning the pogroms, the versions of the pogroms, and they're watching it and they're like, what is going on? And to them, it represents a breakdown in order. It's not about, they don't have a view on Israel, Palestine. It's just like they're like, this is chaos. And there's vandalizing the Starbucks store in the strip mall in my neighborhood.
They're stopping traffic to the airport, which, to hospitals, which pisses off people even for righteous causes,
Exactly. And so they're just looking at all this and saying, like, this is a total breakdown. And I think if Biden took that on and looked to appear that taking on his own base on in service of restoring order, I actually think it's a political winner. Now, obviously, you can't test it until you do it because these things are very. But so that would be my political advice to Joe Biden.
I see it. I agree with all of that. I see it slightly differently insofar as there's a huge frustration of mine about this conversation in general, which is that because for legitimate and understandable journalistic reasons, the squeaky wheels are getting all the attention, right? So like the people doing the protests are getting the attention. The people who are angry are getting the attention. The Michigan voters who organize to do this uncommitted thing, that's whether it's as impressive as they think it is a clap for a foregone conclusion primary. It's a brilliant PR move. People who get the attention, look for attention, get attention. Never mind stopping traffic and, defacing paintings and all that garbage. And it creates this environment which says this is the problem for Biden that he needs to fix, which is the intended purpose of this organization in the first place. What people don't talk about is the sound of the other hand not clapping, which is like, let's say Biden embraces the Rashida Tlaib position 90%. I mean, can't do it 100%, but like 90%. Does he lose more than he gains? Because first of all, Jews vote too. They're high propensity voters. They're in places like Pennsylvania that he needs. They actually exist in Michigan. But also pro-Israel is a more popular position in America than anti-Israel. And so people talk about this like it's the pebble in his shoe that he needs to deal with, without ever realizing that if he deals with this problem in the way they want, it creates a bigger problem. And so the alternative strategy everyone talks about is worse for him politically than what he's basically been doing. I mean, it's all muddled now because rhetorically he's sort of siding with Tlaib's, while policy-wise, as you put it, is still siding with the Fettermans. But Fetterman's a good point about this, right? So Fetterman has been dunking from a great
Fettermania,
height.
as I call it. I mean, he's unbelievable.
And like his polling's not fantastic, but he's more popular than Joe Biden, which suggests in places like Pennsylvania, which is pretty representative of the swing states that Biden needs, that you can actually swing way further out there on this stuff and it not be the disaster that you think. But Biden is listening to people in a bubble. You know, it's too much MSNBC, not enough Fox or CNN. Well, CNN's got problems too on this stuff, but not enough sort of thinking about the voters who aren't protesting what he's doing because they agree with it. And that just sort of gets lost in this conversation to a certain extent.
Yeah, I completely agree. I had not actually argued in this point that what first of all, it's not even clear to me where Biden would have to go to, even if you were to say, I'm going to go full tilt here, I'm going to really go for it and take on Israel, really take on Israel, like what that even looks like. I was amazed, amused, actually more amused. Did you see this video of AOC at a Brooklyn movie theater? So she and her fiance are at a movie theater in Brooklyn last Monday, a week ago, Monday afternoon, which was also interesting to me that AOC is just like at the movies on a Monday. I'd like to go to movies on a Monday. But anyway, so she's at a movie theater in Brooklyn on a Monday afternoon, and these protesters who are filming on their phones go after her. And they're criticizing her for not being anti-Israel enough. AOC, who's a card-carrying, flag-waving member of the squad, stands shoulder to shoulder with, Tlaib and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. I mean, she's as out there as one could expect, or as one could imagine. And their accusation of her was that she was not calling what Israel is doing a genocide. That's what they were saying. And she kind of said, well, I sort of have said they are, but maybe, I don't know, maybe she hadn't gone as far as they wanted her to go. And so to your point, like, what is enough? Like, what would, even if Biden were to really go for it, what does go for it mean? And to really, really, really go for it I think would alienate so much of the electorate that yes, it is very high cost, which again, I keep come back to this. Maybe he's right. I hate to say this. Mm-hmm. Maybe the fight with Bibi helps him, because just like those Michigan voters who are voting uncommitted in the Michigan primary, so it's a no cost way of protesting, maybe the fight with Bibi is no cost, meaning he gets to say he's doing something. He gets to hate on Bibi the way the progressive left hates on Bibi. But ultimately, he can, by November, when all this is, I think, in the Biden team's mind, hopefully in their mind, it is all behind them. It's all in the rearview mirror. What most voters who will matter to them, which are the larger electorate that you're referring to, what they'll remember is that Israel was attacked in the most ghoulish way one could ever possibly imagine. And Biden stood with Israel. And now it's behind us. And he gets the benefit of that. And during this period of peak tension around this issue, he's seen as fighting with Bibi. Again, I don't like it, but I just think that just must be their calculation. I can't understand what their calculation otherwise would be.
You're generous to stay on. There's just one last thing I wanted to get at, in part because a friend of mine sent me a text over the weekend that was really, really depressing. He was saying how he had just had a long conversation with some Israeli American tech entrepreneurs who had their funding pulled because they were Israeli. And they had this long conversation about whether or not they actually needed to just simply change their names and go full converso, because the environment is so bad, it's so anti-Semitic, right? And I was telling another friend about this, who was talking about how, yeah, it's even worse than you think, because, like Netflix is quietly kind of like killing Israeli productions because they're too poisonous to air around the world and all that kind of stuff. And our friend John Podhoretz has this argument that like the golden age for the Jews is over. I think Frank Forward just sort of wrote a very similar artitle.
Frank basically knocked off most of Podhoretz's piece, but we'll be that as a way.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet. I hope he at least name checked Pod for it.
No, unfortunately not. But
that's not cool. And I'm just wondering, like, how bullish are you or bearish on, to use two really inappropriate terms for talking about Jews, but in America, but how do you feel about that argument and like what the future looks like in the next 5 years, 10 years for Jews in America?
So specifically on the tech issue, on what your friend had told you about these, I obviously I don't know the details of that specific case, but I have not seen, I'm following the tech community pretty closely, and I have not, first of all, there are about 450 multinationals that have major operations in Israel, like every major multinational tech company, Apple, Meta, Intel, just go any brand name you can think of. Non-tech companies have been major innovation centers in Israel, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Medtronic. So everyone's there. I have not seen any of them shut down post October 7th, or even talk about shutting down, or even making a statement that they're shrinking their presence considerably. So that's one data point. Second data point is there has been a slowdown in venture capital backing Israeli companies, backing Israeli deals, but on a per capita basis, Israel still attracts more global venture capital than any country in the world. And I don't know how much of that, I think most of that reduction is global macro trends, that there's there's the macro tech dynamic at play here. That if tech is the biggest source of economic growth in your economy, your economy is going to get hit. I have not heard of cases that you're describing where people feel so like Israel's so tainted as such a difficult issue that they have to like pretend they're not Israeli. I have not seen that. To the contrary, what's interesting is, at least in the Gulf, the Saudis, and I've spoken to Saudi officials directly about this, they want normalization. They wanted normalization on October 6th. They want normalization now. They want to get through this period one way or the other and be able to resume their path to normalization. And Israelis are, in the tech community, are aware of that, are aware of what's already happened with the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, and they think the Saudi situation is around the corner. And so I don't think the Israeli tech community feels stigmatized to the point that they have to take drastic steps. I think the television scene is different. So I spoke to someone who's a serious player in the Israeli tech ecosystem, and she made the point to me last week that there are two problems. One problem is, because unlike tech, television is a mass market brand. It's a mass market product. So you don't only have to get,
it's not B2B.
Right. You don't have to just convince the venture capital investor in Menlo Park to back you. You've got to actually explain to millions of viewers why your embracing an Israeli product. It's just that so for that reason, it's a much more tense issue, and the people who populate that industry, shall we say, are either themselves believers in some of the craziest ideas on the progressive left, or at least intimidated by those who are the loudest voices in that industry, as we saw Sunday night at the Oscars. And then there's another aspect which I had not even thought of. She said to me, the other problem is if you think about most of these Israeli television shows that have been successful over the last decade and a half, one way or the other, most of them, not all, most of them are anchored around stories of the Israeli military, Israeli intelligence, in many cases about the juggernaut and the supreme otherworldly effectiveness of Israeli military and intelligence capabilities and personnel. And after October 7th, that's a harder story to tell.
Yeah.
We don't, the Israelis don't look so cool. They used to look really cool. Everyone thought they were really cool. Now, that was kind of like a nightmare. So she also made the point that a lot of the stuff that's being pitched out there has a storyline that doesn't exactly work post October 7th. So she was worried. So I'm more worried about the television scene than I am, because the Israeli television scene has been booming the last, kind of 12 years. And I'm more worried about the Israeli television scene than the Israeli tech scene. I actually think the Israeli tech scene is going to come out stronger after this war. But
and what about higher education? Do you think we've
in Israel, or the way Jews and Israelis are welcomed?
Just in the United States now, right? I mean, there seemed like this moment after the Claudine Gay fiasco, there's going to be this reckoning and it's going to get worked out. And this is, all these liberals were red-pilled about all this. And then it kind of feels like you have all these kids doing these 12-hour hunger strikes, which I like to call skipping lunch for Palestine.
It's not even my favorite is when they start the 12-hour hunger strike at 10 o'clock at night.
Right.
So they're like, so basically, so you're going to bed.
Right. And then I'll eat a late breakfast and there you go. So do you think it's sort of, that was a moment of hopefulness of getting their act together and it's not going to happen, or not?
Yeah, I'm very pessimistic about higher education in the United States generally, but especially for Jews. I think that, first of all, I just see it now. I'm very involved in the universe of the community of Jewish families in the United States who their kids are applying to college, or they will be applying to college soon. And these are all people who had aspirations to send their kids to the best schools in the United States. And I cannot believe the list of target schools and the schools that are getting, crossed off the list.
Yeah.
Some of the best schools in the United States, schools that, families would have killed to have their children attend. And now they're saying, nope, not going, no. And then suddenly the schools that are on the list, which are like the hot schools, there are now all these schools, interestingly, mostly in the South, that schools that I don't think would have been on the radar of the most successful, educated, affluent families in the American Jewish community. These are schools you would have literally never heard these families talk about 5 years ago, 3 years ago. And now these schools are the hot schools, and or at least of increasing interest. So I think there's a shift going on. And what I hear from families, Jonah, is they say, look, can my kid handle going to a school where there's can my kids go to school where it is so unpleasant and they have to deal with anti-Semitism and spend 4 years there and get out of it okay? Sure, they can handle it, but it sucks.
Yeah,
it sucks. Why should they go through that?
It sucks.
And paying for it sucks, and it's just miserable. So why should they go through that? And so I think American Jews who are thinking about college now for their kids or for themselves are basically saying, yes, it's wonderful that Harvard got rid of Claudine Gay, and it's great that Penn got rid of Liz McGill, but that's detoppling, like a bigger problem. The rot in these institutions is so deep and has been embedded for so long that unless you have major systemic reform, that's going to take a very long time. You're just getting rid of the president of this school or that school doesn't solve the problem.
All right, I wish we could go on, but as listeners can't tell, but Chris Starwalt's glorious face appeared briefly here because he was joining me for the next podcast I'm about to record.
That was, by the way, that was like a window into like if the Remnant podcast and the Dispatch podcast had like the version of Behind the Music, that would have been like, this would have been an episode and like a little vignette in Behind the Music where suddenly Chris Starward pops on. You give him the shh signal. He looks horrified, like completely, and then he disappears and then he's gone. He just hits the.
This is the life we've chosen, my friend.
That was fantastic.
Dan Senor, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. The book is The Genius of Israel, still available wherever fine books are found. And the podcast is Call Me Back. Look it up. It's great. It's if you thought this was granular, try that thing. And and I hope to have you back soon.
Great. Thanks, John. I appreciate it. Always good to be with you.
Okay. As I had said at the front of this thing, I'm recording this long after we had the conversation. I thought it was a good conversation. I think it's good to catch up on this stuff from time to time. I need to do a similar thing on Ukraine soon. And if you have other sort of newsy topics that you think I should do an update kind of podcast on about where things stand and what's changed and all that, let me know in the comments or by email or carrier pigeon or whatever. I should also note that story I told about a friend who had some Israeli American friends who were in the tech center. I just wanted to clarify a little bit because I got some new intel on it. Their issues had less to do with the tech industry in terms of the global tech environment and Israel, which is what I was sort of talking about with Dan, and more to do with what's happening actually on the ground in New York. That in New York or in the world, in the microcosm part of it that these guys are dealing with, being Israeli has transaction costs. Let's put it that way. And I think we can see that also on college campuses, being Israeli or being proudly Jewish or identifiably Jewish. I always think that that's sort of one of these kind of very creepy locutions that we have these days, because when you say identifiably Jewish, it doesn't mean counting noses. It means counting like yarmulkes or looking at Orthodox people who both literally and figuratively wear their Jewishness on their sleeve to one extent or another. That has transaction costs too in the culture, and in certain segments of the culture, I should say. Anyway, I'm not sure what else I have to add to all of this because I can't remember all the bells and whistles of the conversation in a way that I won't confuse things even more. But thanks again to Dan Senor. Thank you for listening. And hey, you know what you might want to do? Subscribe to the Dispatch. So with that, I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.